The formation of the Zend Avesta continues. Thus, the Pahlavi translation of the Vendidad, which was not finished before the latter end of the Sassanian dynasty, contains not a few Zend quotations from books which are no longer in existence. Other quotations, as remarkable in their importance as in their contents, are to be found in Pahlavi and Parsi tracts, like the Nirangistan and the Aogama Ede. The Bundahis contains much matter which is not spoken of in the existing Avesta, but which is very likely to have been taken from Zend books, which were still in the hands of its compiler. It is a tradition of the Parsis that the Yasts were originally 30 in number, there having been one for each of the 30 Izads who preside over the 30 days of the month, yet there are only 18 still extant. The cause that preserved the Avesta is obvious. Taken as a whole, it does not profess to be a religious encyclopedia, but only a liturgical collection, and it bears more likeness to a prayer book than to the Bible. Well, the Quran's a prayer book. It's meant to be prayed. A lot of religious texts that were supposed to have been revealed or represent what was revealed come off like something that you ritually recite or include in the middle of a ritual or something. It can be readily conceived that the Vendidad Sada, which had to be recited every day, would be more carefully preserved than the Yasts, which are generally recited once a month, and these again more carefully than other books, which, however sacred they might be, were not used in the performance of worship. Many texts, no doubt, were lost in consequence of the Arab conquest, but mostly such as would have been more important in the eyes of the theologian than in those of the priest. We have a fair specimen of what these lost texts may have been in the few non-liturgical fragments which we still possess, such as the Vistasp Yast and the blessing of Zoroaster upon King Vistasp, which belong to the old epic cycle of Iran, and the Hadbakht Nosk, which treats of the fate of the soul after death. And let us remember that under Islamic law, as opposed to, in contrast to Christianity and Judaism, there's not this attack of, the media of other faiths. Certainly temples and texts may be abandoned by those who convert, but 3. But if we have lost much of the Sassanian sacred literature, Sassanian Persia herself, if we may trust Parsi tradition, had lost more of the original books. The primitive Avesta is revealed by Ormazd de Zoroaster, and by Zoroaster de Vistasp, king of Bactria, was supposed to have been composed of 21 nosks or books, the greater part of which was burnt by Iskander the Rumi, Alexander the Great. After his death, the priests of the Zoroastrian religion met together, and by collecting the various fragments that had escaped the ravages of the war, and others that they knew by heart, they formed the present collection, which is a very small part of the original book, as out of the 21 nosks, there was only one that was preserved in its entirety, the Vendidad. And so, see, we basically have what was available before the conquest of the Arabs. This tradition is very old and may be traced back from present period even to Sassanian times. It involves the assumption that the Avesta is the remnant of the sacred literature of Persia under the last Achaemenian kings. To ascertain whether this inference is correct, and to what extent it may be so, we must first try to define, as accurately as we can, the exact time at which the collection now in existence was formed. The Ravat quoted above states that it was formed after the death of Iskander, which presently is rather vague, and it may as well mean centuries after his death as immediately after his death. It is, in fact, hardly to be doubted that the latter was really what the writer meant, yet, as the date of the Ravat is very recent, we had better look for older and more precise traditions. We find such a one in the Dinkart, a Pahlavi book, which enjoys great authority with the Parsis of our days, which, although it contains many things of late origin, also comprises many old and valuable traditions. We find in it a description of the four classes, which strikingly reminds one of the Brahmanical account of the origin of castes, and which was certainly borrowed from India. Whether at the time of the last Sassanians, when Persia learnt so much from India, or since the settlement of the Parsis in India, we are unable to decide, yet the former seems more probable. And wonder if there's that huge gap with the Parsis of their non-historical existence, that there was a people here, and then you have the people here claiming to be descended from this people here. Have they proved through genetics or anything like that? But if they're reviving for themselves, that's fine too. According to a proclamation ascribed to Khosrab Anno Sharvan, 531 to 579 of the Common Era, the collection of the Avesta fragments was begun in the reign of the last Arsacids, and was finished under Shapur II in 309 to 380 of the Common Era. King Volkash Vologeses, otherwise known as, it is said, first ordained the fragments of the Avesta, which might have escaped the ravages of Iskander, are been preserved by oral tradition, to be searched for and collected together. First Sassanian king Ardashir Babagan made the Avesta the sacred book of Iran, and Mazdaism the state religion. At last, Adarbad, under Shapur II, purified the Avesta and fixed the number of the Nasks, and Shapur proclaimed to the heterodox, now that we have recognized the law of the world here below, they shall not allow the infidelity of anyone whatever, as I shall strive that it may be so. Now, in earlier periods before Alexander the Great, we do have evidence that there were changes going on. It is said that during the Magian period, before that, they destroyed the skins that contain the original revelations that came through Zarathustra and his inspired sayings too, I guess, were 5. The authenticity of this record has been called in question chiefly, I think, on account of the part that it ascribes to an Arsacid prince, which seems hardly to agree with the ideas generally entertained about the character of the Sassanian Revolution. Most Parsi and Muslim writers agree that it was the Sassanian dynasty which raised the Zoroastrian religion from the state of humiliation into which the Greek invasion had made it sink, and while it gave the signal for a revival of the old national spirit, made Mazdaism one of the cornerstones of the new establishment. Therefore, it seems strange to hear that the first steps taken to make Mazdaism a state religion was taken by one of those very Hellenic Parthian princes who were so imbued with Greek ideas and manners. Yet, this is the very reason why we ought to feel some hesitation in rejecting this document, and its being at variance with the general Parsi view speaks rather for its authenticity, for as it was the general post-Sassanian tradition that the restoration of Mazdaism was the work of the first Sassanian kings, no Parsi would have ever thought of making them share what was in his eyes their first and best title of honor with any of the despised princes of the Parthian dynasty. 6. It is difficult, of course, to prove directly the authenticity of this record, the more so as we do not even know who was the king alluded to. There were, in fact, 4 kings at least who bore the name of Balkhash. The most celebrated and best known of the 4 was Vologases, the contemporary of Nero. Now that the Zoroastrianism prevailed with him, or at least with members of his family, we see from the conduct of his brother Tiridates, who was a magus, and by this term we must not understand a magician, well, at least not in the sense of a slur, but a priest and one of the Zoroastrian religion. Pliny was very often confounds magism and magia, magians and magicians. We know from Pliny, too, that Tiridates refused to initiate Nero into his art, but the cause was not, as he assumes, that he was a detestable, frivolous, and vain, that it was a detestable, frivolous, and vain art, but because Mazdian law forbids the holy knowledge to be revealed to laymen, which much more to foreigners. Yast 4:10, and Philostrati Vita Sophia, is that 50:10? I think that's supposed to be, or maybe that's, I think that's an I, never mind. So 1:10. But they called them such because the word magus in Greek referred to their skills. So it's the art and science of religion. The magician was the skilled worker, because in most paths, the populace weren't, it's not the same etymology as Magian in the Persian languages, but or Majus or something, the Arabic term for them. But yeah, it was a strange thing. The Jews had a priestly class, and everybody else had a priestly class in which, you couldn't do your basic things. But the people they called Zoroastrians weren't like that. That he was a priest? Appears from Tacitus' testimony. That he was a Zoroastrian is shown by the sculptures, by the scruples about the worship of the elements. When he came from Asia to Rome to receive the crown of Armenia at the hands of Nero, he wanted not to come by sea, but rode along the coasts. He crossed only the Hellespont, because the Magi were forbidden to defile the sea. rumbling the tumbling here. This is quite in the spirit of latter Zoroastrianism, and savors much of Mazdaism, that Algessus himself shared the religious scruples of his brother, appears from his answer to Nero, who insisted upon his coming to Rome. Also, come yourself, it is easier for you to cross such immensity of sea. And Dio Cassius 63:4. The answer was mistaken for an insult by Nero, and as it seems by Dio himself, in fact, Vologesus remained to the last faithful to the memory of Nero. Nero 57. What we know, moreover, of his personal character qualifies him for taking initiative in a religious work. He seems to have been a man of contemplative mind rather than a man of action, which often excited anger or scorn of people against him, and he had the glory of breaking with the family of Parthian kings. Tacitus Annales 15:1 and 2. It was under his reign that the first interference of religion with politics, of which history, Persia speaks, took place, as he was called by the people of Adiabene, against their king, Isetes, who had become a Jew. Josephus 24:2. 7. Thus, we hear on one hand from the Parsees that the first collection of the Avesta was made by an Arsacid named Vologesus, and we hear on the other hand from a quite independent source that an Arsacide named Vologesus believed himself as a follower of the Avesta may have done. In all this, there is no evidence that it is Vologesus who is mentioned in the Dinkart, much less that he was really the first editor of the Avesta, but it shows, at all events, that the first attempt to recover the sacred literature of Iran might very well have been made by an Arsacide, and that we may trust in this matter to a document which has been written perhaps by a Sassanian king, but at any rate in a Sassanian spirit, in fact, in the struggle between Artaban and Ardashir. There was no religious interest at stake, but only a political one. And we are very expressly told by Hamza that between Ardashir and his adversaries there was perfect accordance in religion, in religious matters. It can therefore be fairly admitted that even in the time and at the court of the Philhellenic Parthians, they love the Greek culture, in other words, the Zoroastrian movement may have originated, and that there came a time when they perceived that a national religion is a part of national life. It was the merit of the Sassanids that they saw the drift of this idea, which they had the good fortune to carry out, and this would not be the only instance in the history of the world of an idea being sown by one party and its advantages, reaped by their adversaries. Now, we see evidence that before all this, more and more actually, that the faith was open to those of other births and nationalities. But, they're closing it off. But, and also it wasn't something forced on the people. 8. Another presumptive evidence of the groundwork of the Avesta being anterior to the age of the Sassanians is given by the language in which it is written. That language not only was not, but had never been, the national language of Persia. It is indeed closely connected with the ancient Persian, as found in the cuneiform inscriptions of the Achaemenian kings, from which modern Persia is derived, but the relations between ancient Persia and Zend are of such a kind that neither language can be convinced as being derived from the other. They are not one and the same language in two different stages of its development, but two independent dialects, in nearly the same stage, which is a proof that they did not belong to the same country, and therefore that Zend was not the language of Persia. Now, the language used in Persia after the death of Alexander under the Arsacids and Sassanids, that is, during the period in which the Avesta must have been edited, was Pahlavi, and was not derived from Zend, but from ancient Persian, being the middle dialect between the ancient and modern Persian. Therefore, if the Sassanian kings had concealed the project of having religious books of their own written and composed, it is not likely that they would have had them written in an old foreign dialect, but in the old national language. The more so, because owing both to their origin and their policy, they were bound to be representatives of the genuine old Persian tradition. Therefore, if they adopted Zend as the language of religion, it must have been because it was already to what they appeared, that is to say, because the only remnants of sacred literature then extant were written in Zend, and the editors of the Avesta had Zend writings before them. This does not, of course, prove that all we find in the Avesta is pre-Sassanian, and that the editors did not compose new Zend texts, although Zend was not only a dead language, but also a foreign one. It was not an unknown language, that it was well understood by the learned class. The priests appears from the Pahlavi translation, which was made by them, and which the deeper one enters into the meaning of the text, has the fuller justice done to its merits. The earliest date that can be ascribed to that translation in its present form is the last century of the Sassanian dynasty, as it contained an allusion to the death of the Harisarch Musdak, the son of Vendidad, who was put to death in the beginning of the reign of Khosrav Ano Sharafan, about 531. Now, the ability to translate a dead language is a good test of the ability to write in it, and in the question of the age of the Zend texts, the possibility of new ones having been composed by the editors cannot be excluded a priori. Nay, we shall see further on that there are passages in these texts which look very modern, and may have been written at the time when the book took its last and definitive form. But whatever may be the proportion of the new texts to the old ones, which I believe to be very small, it is quite certain that the bulk of the Avesta is pre-Sassanian. Sassanian, yeah. And we can definitely say that, okay, well, if the text can be pre-whatever, but if it's, edited, completely new text, I would say that relatively little of that would be occurring in this case. Like, the book of Daniel's like 1,000 years before when the Jews and Christians tend to say Daniel was. I mean, it's at least that, because there's some other text about, the same character that predate it, that are about 1500 BCE rather than, 500 something. Well, actually, right into the 400 something is the Christian, is the Jewish version of that. But there are probably more than one text. And anyways, 9. The date assigned by the Dinkart to the first edition of the Avesta and to its promulgation as a sacred law of the nation agrees with what we know of the religious state of Iran in the times of Shapur II, Mazdaism had just been threatened with destruction by a new religion sprung from itself, the religion of Mani, which, for a while, numbered a king among its followers, Shapur I, 240 to 270. Those are the years of his reign, right? Mazdaism was shaken for a long time, and when Mani was put to death, it was called Manichaeism because Mani Kai, so Mani lives. His work did not perish with him. In the Kissa-e-Sangha, Zoroaster is introduced, prophesying that the holy religion will be overthrown 3 times and restored 3 times. Overthrown the first time by Iskander, it will be restored by Ardashir. Overthrown again, it will be restored by Shapur II and Adarbad, Mahraspand, and lastly, it will be overthrown by the Arabs and restored at the end of time by the Socios, the world savior, but not in the Christian sense. So they're putting it back thing. This is why people think of Zoroaster as like maybe he's a few different. Maybe there wasn't one Zarathustra. There was a series of the Magian and the Achaemenian and the Sassanian. Each period had its mark. So perhaps who leading the charge had more of his personality added there unto, the thing. There's certain other revivals, but not quite to those extents, right? The Parsi tradition about Adarbad, although they are mixed with much fable, allows some historical truth to show itself. He was a holy man under Shapur II, who, as there were many religions and heresies in Iran, and the true religion was falling into oblivion, restored it through a miracle, as he gave a sign of its truth by allowing melted brass to be poured on his breast without his being injured. Sounds like one of those punishments in the Vedas about, it's a poor person that has heard the scripture, pour this up, setting aside the miracle, which is most probably borrowed from the legend of Zoroaster. This account receives its true interpretation from the passages in the Kissa-e-Sangha and the Dinkart, which apply that Adarbad restored Mazdaism, which had been shaken by the Manichaean heresy. There's the Mazdakian and some other deviant cults, you could say. Mazdayasnahe, Zarathustrahe, Mazdayasnian, Zarathustrian is, what they called it. Mazdaism is, I guess, a new term that they came up with around this time to call it a faith, but basically they worship God. They sing praises to God and all that. And that in order to settle it upon a solid and lasting base, he gave a definitive form to the religious book of Iran and closed the Holy Writ. And even nowadays, the Parsi, while reciting the Patet, acknowledges Adarbad as the third founder of the Avesta, the first being Zoroaster, who received it from Ormazd, the second Gamasps, who received it from Zoroaster, and the third Adarbad, who taught it and restored it to its purity. Therefore, so far as we can trust to inferences that rest upon such scanty and vague testimonies, it seems likely that the Avesta took its definitive form from the hands of Adarbad, Mahraspand, under King Shapur II, in consequence of the dangers with which Mani's heresy had threatened the national religion, as the death of Mani and the first persecution of his followers took place some 30 years before Shapur's accession to the throne. It may be presumed that the last revision of the Avesta was made in the first years of the new reign, when the agitation aroused by Mani's doctrines and imperfectly allayed by the persecution of his disciples had not yet subsided. and the old religion was still shaking on its base. 10. I guess before 10 we have a footnote here. Shapur II ascended the throne about 309 before being born, as the tradition goes, and as he appears from the Dinkart to have taken a personal part in the work of Adarbad, the promulgation of the Avesta can hardly have been taken place at an earlier date than 325 to 330. Adarbad and the fathers at Nisa lived and worked in the same age. Is it Nika'a? And the Zoroastrian threats of the king of Iran and the Catholic anathemas of the Kaiser of Rome may have been issued on the same day. 10. It follows here, hence, that the Zend Avesta text may have been composed even as late as the 4th century of the Common Era. This is, of course, a mere theoretical possibility. Theories are supposed to be based on the evidence. Theories not, I'm making a guess here. Even if it's an educated guess, the hypothesis is still not a theory, so, yeah. This is, of course, okay. For although the liturgical parts of the Yasna, the Visperad, the Si Rosa, and the Corda Avesta must be ascribed to a later time than the Gathas, the Vendidad, and the Yasts, and may belong to some period of revision. They certainly do not belong to the period of this last revision. Adarbad was only the last editor of the Vesta, and it is likely, nay, it is beyond all question that the doctors of the law, before his time, had tried to put the fragments in order, to connect them, to fill up the gaps, as far as the practical purposes of liturgy required. Therefore, instead of saying that there are parts of the Avesta that may belong so late to a period as the 4th century, it may be more correct to say that no part of it can belong to a later date. And you could say that versions perhaps maybe had verses and stuff put in, just like in the Bible, or they changed a word here and there, but it's mostly just commentary at that point that was different.